Carlo Gambino walked into Harlem like it was for sale. He sent an envelope thick with cash and thin with respect. Bumpy Johnson didn't open it. He sent it back with something the Italians hadn't seen in years, a boundary they couldn't cross. Carlo Gambino walked into Harlem like it was for sale. He didn't come himself, men like that never do. He sent a courier instead. White face, clean shoes. Wool coat too expensive for a messenger, too plain for a boss. The man stepped out of a black Cadillac on Lenox Avenue like he was delivering groceries, not walking into the heartbeat of Black Harlem, with an envelope thick with cash and thin with respect. It was Tuesday afternoon, 2:15, late June heat rising from the pavement in waves. The sun was high and merciless. The block was alive, kids playing stickball with a broomstick and taped-up ball, women hanging laundry from fire escapes, their laughter carrying down to the street. Men were leaning against storefronts reading newspapers, discussing Jackie Robinson, discussing politics, discussing survival. Normal Harlem rhythms. The pulse of a community that had learned to thrive despite everything designed to break it. Until the Cadillac pulled up. The envelope was yellow manila, bulging, sealed with red wax stamped with an ornate G. $50,000 inside the price Gambino thought Harlem was worth. The price he thought could buy a kingdom. Bumpy Johnson sat outside the barbershop. Same chair he'd occupied every Tuesday for 15 years. Same corner where he'd built an empire without ever raising his voice above a whisper. Same eyes that had seen Dutch Schultz try to own Harlem in the 30s. Seen Lucky Luciano try to franchise it in the 40s. Seen the Italians try every method they knew: violence, bribery, intimidation, partnership, and fail. He was 53 years old. Looked younger. Dressed in a dark suit that cost more than most men earned in a month, but wore it like work clothes. No jewelry, no flash. Just quiet, undeniable authority. Bumpy and Marcus Williams had grown up together. Same block, same schools. Same dreams of escaping poverty, but life had taken them different directions. Marcus chose the Postal Service, steady, legal, respectable. Bumpy chose the streets, dangerous, illegal, powerful. They'd remained friends through it all. Until 10 years ago, when Marcus told Bumpy he couldn't let his daughter Ruby around that life anymore. Bumpy understood, respected it. They drifted apart, but some bonds don't break. They just wait. The courier stopped 6 feet away from Bumpy's chair, didn't speak. Just extended the envelope with a hand that betrayed him trembling slightly, enough to make the envelope shake. Bumpy didn't move, didn't blink. The street went quiet in that slow, dangerous way, like a held breath before a storm. Barbershop clippers stopped buzzing. Dice games paused mid-roll. Mrs. Patterson, hanging sheets on her third-floor line, stopped to watch. Mr. Chun, sweeping outside his grocery, leaned on his broom. Every man, woman, and child on that block knew what that envelope meant: money, partnership, submission. The courier's hand started to shake harder now, not much. Just enough. A tremor that said he understood, finally, that he wasn't delivering mail. He was standing at the border of two worlds, and only one of them would let him leave alive. The summer heat pressed down, a car horn blared 2 blocks away. A child laughed. Life continued everywhere except in the 3 feet between Bumpy and the courier. Bumpy finally looked up. Not at the envelope, at the man holding it, studied his face. Memorized it. Put it on the chair, the courier obeyed. Set it down like it was burning his fingers. Like it was evidence of a crime he didn't want connected to him. Turned, walked back to the Cadillac without another word, without looking back, moving faster with each step. The engine started. The car drove south. Disappeared into traffic on 125th Street. The envelope sat there, thick, unmarked, except for that red wax seal. Heavy with bills and heavier with assumption. It sat there with the belief that everything, every person, every principle, every promise had a price. Bumpy let it sit for a full minute, let the whole block see it. Let them understand what Carlo Gambino thought Harlem was worth. Let them watch him decide what their sovereignty meant. Then he stood, slow, deliberate, picked it up with 2 fingers, like it was contaminated. Like touching it too long might infect him with the disease of compromise. He didn't open it. handed it to Uni, his right hand, who'd been standing in the barbershop doorway the entire time, watching, waiting. Send it back. 2 words. No explanation, no anger, no hesitation. Just the boundary they couldn't cross. What Bumpy didn't say, what he didn't need to say because Uni already understood, was that sending that envelope back wasn't rejection. It was declaration. A statement that would echo through New York's underworld for decades. And within 72 hours, every mobster from the Bronx to Brooklyn would understand what it cost to test Harlem's sovereignty. The block exhaled. Life resumed. But everyone knew something had just shifted in the architecture of power. To understand why Bumpy sent that envelope back, you need to understand what Harlem was in 1960. Not the Harlem of desperation that would come later, when heroin would carve the neighborhood into something unrecognizable. Not the Harlem of decay that Hollywood would immortalize in films that showed only ruin, never resilience. Not the Harlem that white media loved to portray as chaos needing salvation. This was the Harlem of possibility. The Harlem of Sugar Ray Robinson opening his nightclub. Of James Baldwin writing in Paris but dreaming of home. Of Malcolm X preaching on street corners. Of Duke Ellington's music drifting from the Cotton Club. This was the Harlem where black excellence wasn't theory. It was architecture. 300,000 souls living between 110th and 155th Street. Teachers who educated children the public schools had given up on. Doctors who treated patients white hospitals turned away. Jazz musicians who created America's only original art form. Seamstresses who sewed dreams into fabric. Postal workers who delivered more than mail, they delivered dignity. Shop owners who kept their stores open during hard times because they knew the neighborhood needed them. Preachers who built churches that were more than buildings, they were fortresses of hope. People who'd migrated north from Jim Crow's South believing the American promise, then built their own version when America failed them. Again, and again, and again. Harlem had a price once. During Prohibition, white mobsters treated it like a gold mine with black faces guarding the entrance. Dutch Schulte numbers and extracted millions. Lucky Luciano ran heroin and destroyed thousands of lives. Oni Madden owned the Cotton Club and wouldn't let black customers through the door. Black performers entertained white audiences in a black neighborhood. They paid off local operators, installed puppets, and called it business. They extracted wealth and called it partnership. They'd built empires on Harlem's back and never paid rent. Bumpy Johnson changed that, not overnight, not with manifestos or movements, not with speeches about justice or appeals to morality. With 30 years of quiet, calculated, systematic refusal to bow. He didn't fight the Italians for territory that would have been war, and war destroys communities. Instead, he made them understand that Harlem was never theirs to take. The numbers racket, the policy banks, the after-hours clubs, the protection, the loan sharking, all of it ran through men and women who answered to the neighborhood first and profit second. The money flowed through Bumpy, but it didn't stop with Bumpy. That was the system he built. Not revolutionary, not idealistic. Practical. Every dollar that came into Harlem, a percentage stayed in Harlem. Every business that operated in Harlem, a portion of profit went back into Harlem. Schools that needed books, churches that needed repairs, families that couldn't make rent, kids who needed winter coats, funerals for people who died with nothing. It wasn't charity. It was infrastructure, it was insurance. It was the price of legitimacy. Because Bumpy understood something the Italians never would. You can't rule a community that doesn't need you. But if you become the reason the community survives, you don't need guns to maintain power. You don't need fear. You just need to keep your promises. That was the difference Carlo Gambino didn't understand. In Little Italy in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, power came from fear and favor. You paid up or got buried. You showed respect or got taught respect. Simple, clean, efficient. The Italian model worked because it assumed people would always choose survival over dignity. But Harlem wasn't built that way. Harlem was built on trust earned in church basements and barbershop corners. It was built on grandmothers who ran numbers out of their kitchens and fed the block when times were hard. It was built on men like Bumpy who made sure the money stayed in the community, who made sure cops got paid just enough to look the other way, but never enough to own the streets, who made sure that when someone tried to prey on Harlem's children, there were consequences the law wouldn't deliver. Gambino's envelope was an insult wrapped in business language. It said, "I know what you're worth. Here's your cut. Now step aside and let real power operate." What it didn't say, what men like Gambino never understood, was that Bumpy didn't work for a cut. He didn't work for money or status or recognition. He worked for a legacy. The Italians saw Harlem as a market to be exploited. Bumpy saw it as a kingdom to be protected. And kingdoms don't get purchased with cash and envelopes. They get inherited through sacrifice, defended through loyalty, or taken by force through blood. Gambino had done the math wrong. He thought the money in that envelope was enough to make Bumpy a partner. What he didn't calculate was that Bumpy had already chosen his partners decades ago. Every runner who collected numbers on 125th Street and knew their families would eat if times got hard. Every landlord who kept rent stable when he didn't have to because Bumpy asked. Every cop who knew better than to shake down the wrong corner because Bumpy had made the rules clear. Every grandmother who trusted Bumpy to keep the block safe so her grandchildren could play outside. They were the infrastructure. They were the kingdom. They were the reason Harlem stood. The envelope was just paper. Uni held it in his hands now, standing in the back room of the barbershop, waiting for orders. He knew what it meant to send it back. It meant rejecting the largest crime family in New York. It meant telling Carlo Gambino that Harlem had a border he couldn't cross with money, soldiers, or influence. It meant war was possible. Bumpy lit a cigarette, took one long drag. Let the smoke curl upward toward the ceiling fan that barely moved the humid air. Looked at the envelope one last time, then looked at Uni. Walk it back yourself. Hand it to whoever gave it to that courier. Don't say a word. Just hand it back. Uni nodded. He understood. Silence was the sharpest message Bumpy had ever sent. And when that envelope landed on a table in Little Italy, it wouldn't just be paper anymore. It would be a line drawn in blood that hadn't spilled yet, but would if anyone was stupid enough to cross it. Carlo Gambino didn't make mistakes. That's what separated him from every other boss who'd burned out, got arrested, or ended up face down in the East River with concrete shoes and unfulfilled ambitions. While Vito Genovese chased respect through violence and ended up in prison, while Joe Profaci started wars over pennies and ended up with 5 families at his throat, while Albert Anastasia ruled through fear and ended up dead in a barber chair, Gambino played chess while everyone else played checkers. That's what made him the boss of bosses. He was 58 years old in 1960, looked like a grandfather who sold insurance, dressed like an accountant at a modest firm. Lived in a modest house in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, where neighbors thought he imported olive oil and cheese from Sicily, which in a way he did. He imported tradition. He imported the old ways. He imported power. While other families made headlines, Gambino made money. While other families went to war over pride, Gambino went to war over mathematics. He calculated profit margins like a banker and territory like a general, cold, precise, emotionless. By 1960, he controlled more of New York than any single man in the city's history. The docks every shipment that came through Brooklyn, Staten Island, New Jersey paid tribute. Every union from the Teamsters to the longshoremen answered to Gambino-connected leaders. Construction, you couldn't build a skyscraper in Manhattan without Gambino-connected contractors handling cement, steel, labor, garbage collection. The Garment District. The Fulton Fish Market. Numbers, loan sharking. The entirety of Brooklyn's political machine, from judges to city councilmen. Everything that moved in New York, Gambino moved. Everything that built, Gambino built. Everything that disappeared, Gambino disappeared. Everything except Harlem, and that bothered him. Not because Harlem was the richest territory, it wasn't. The real money was in the docks and unions, in construction and political influence. Not because it had the best rackets numbers and policy banks were profitable, but nothing compared to heroin trafficking, which Gambino carefully avoided because he understood that drugs, brought federal attention that even the best-connected politician couldn't deflect. It bothered him because Harlem was the only neighborhood in New York where Italian money didn't talk, where made men couldn't collect, where the five families had learned, the hard way, that some blocks didn't bend, that some communities had built their own power structure, parallel to the Italian system but fundamentally separate. And in Gambino's orderly mind, that was an anomaly that needed resolution. Bumpy Johnson was the reason. The architect of Harlem's independence. The man who'd done what very few black men in America had managed, created sovereign territory inside a system designed to prevent exactly that. Gambino respected that. In his own cold, transactional way, he respected men who built power without permission, who understood that real power wasn't loud, it was quiet. Wasn't flashy, it was functional. Wasn't about being feared, it was about being necessary. Bumpy had done all that, had built something impressive, but respect didn't mean acceptance. It meant recalculation, so Gambino tried a different approach. Not a threat that had failed in 1948 when Genovese's men tried to muscle Bumpy and ended up in Harlem Hospital with injuries that took months to heal and taught a lesson that lasted years. Not a war that would cost more than Harlem was worth, would bring federal attention, would unite black gangs across the city against Italian interests, would create chaos that hurt everyone's bottom line, a partnership. The envelope wasn't a bribe, it was an offering, a gesture of respect between equals. $50,000 in cash, unmarked bills. Clean money, not skim, not dirty profit from drugs or prostitution, just cash, a gesture. A symbol. A way of saying, we can do this the easy way. You keep running Harlem however you want. I don't interfere. You give us a percentage, say 15%, maybe 20% if you're generous just for the sake of order. For the sake of showing that we can work together, everybody profits, everybody lives, everybody wins. It was brilliant, actually, elegant in its simplicity. It was the same offer Gambino had made to a dozen other operators across the city, and it worked because it was smart business. Because it gave men dignity while taking their independence. Because it made them partners instead of victims. Most took it. The smart ones took it. Because saying no to Carlo Gambino meant saying yes to pressure nobody could withstand forever. To indictments nobody could fight. To labor strikes that destroyed businesses. To enemies you didn't know you had until they were standing over your hospital bed. But Gambino had miscalculated one fundamental thing. Bumpy Johnson wasn't most operators. He wasn't a hustler looking to cash out and retire to Miami with a modest fortune and fading memories. He wasn't a gangster chasing fast money and faster women and the cheap thrills of power without purpose. He was a man who had spent 30 years, 3 full decades of his life making sure Harlem stayed Harlem. Not Little Italy with black faces, not a subsidiary of the Gambino family. Not a market to be extracted and exploited. Not a territory to be conquered and controlled, Harlem, and that required something Gambino's world didn't value, couldn't quantify, couldn't purchase at any price, loyalty that couldn't be bought, principle that couldn't be compromised, identity that couldn't be negotiated. The Italians had always seen black neighborhoods as open markets. During Prohibition, they walked in and took what they wanted. After Prohibition, they installed their own people and called it cooperation. After World War II, they franchised their operations and called it progress. They believed deep down, without question, without ever saying it aloud because some truths are too ugly to speak that power in America was white, and everything else was negotiable. Bumpy had spent his entire life proving that belief wrong, not with speeches, not with protests or marches or appeals to justice that white America would never deliver. Not with violence that would have given them an excuse to destroy Harlem completely. With structure, with discipline, with economics. With a network so deep and so loyal that even when the feds came, even when rivals tried, even when the Italians sent envelopes, Harlem stayed intact. Gambino thought $50,000 could crack that. He thought Bumpy was like every other man he'd ever bought. Practical, survival-minded, smart enough to know when he was outgunned and pragmatic enough to take a profitable compromise. But Bumpy wasn't outgunned. He was outrespected. And respect in Harlem was worth more than every dollar Gambino had ever printed, laundered, or buried. The envelope was already on its way back. Uni walked it through Midtown, past the garment district where seamstresses from a dozen countries bent over sewing machines in 100-degree workshops, creating America's fashion while earning poverty wages. Past the theater district where tourists lined up for matinee shows, spending more on entertainment in an afternoon than most Harlem families earned in a week. Into Little Italy where the streets smelled like fresh bread and espresso and old-world tradition. Where old men in flat caps played bocce in Columbus Park and argued in Sicilian dialects about politics from a country they'd left 40 years ago but never really abandoned. Where the Festa di San Gennaro would soon fill the streets with lights and music and the illusion that this was still Italy, not America. Straight to the social club on Mulberry Street where Gambino's men conducted business behind espresso and newspapers and the facade of cultural preservation. The club had no sign, no name. Just a green door between Lombardi's butcher shop and Russo's shoe repair. You either knew what it was really new, not guessed, or you had no business being there. And if you had business there, you came when summoned, not when convenient. Uni pushed the door open at 3:47 in the afternoon. The social club on Mulberry Street had seen a lot of envelopes over the years. Payoffs from union bosses who needed strikes delayed or accelerated depending on which company paid more. Skim from casino floors in Havana before Castro ruined everything and turned paradise into communist poverty. Protection money wrapped in newspaper from every bakery, butcher shop, and construction site in Lower Manhattan. Political contributions from candidates who needed Italian votes and Italian muscle to win elections. Bribes from judges who wanted to stay judges. Payments from cops who wanted to stay alive. Envelopes meant business. They meant order. They meant the system was working exactly as designed. They meant money flowed upward and power flowed downward and everyone understood their place in the hierarchy. But when Uni walked through that door, every man in the room knew this envelope was different. He didn't knock, didn't ask permission, didn't show deference or fear or the appropriate respect for entering sacred territory. Just stepped inside like he had business there, and in a way he did. The most dangerous kind of business. The kind that made soldiers reach for guns they didn't pull and bosses sit straighter in chairs they didn't leave. 3 card games stopped mid-deal. Cards frozen in hands, money frozen on tables, breath frozen in lungs. Espresso cups hovered between table and lip, the steam rising in the afternoon light that filtered through dirty windows. A man in the back Carmen, the snake Persico, folded his newspaper but didn't lower it. Just watched over the top edge, eyes sharp, calculating, memorizing Uni's face for future reference. For revenge, if revenge became necessary. The room smelled like coffee and cigar smoke and old wood and power, the accumulated scent of 50 years of decisions that shaped a city. Of murders planned, of fortunes divided, of politicians bought, of enemies buried. Uni walked straight to the man at the center table, navigating between chairs and suspicious stares like he walked through rooms like this every day. Sal the pipe Mancuso Gambino's buffer. The man who handled messages so the boss didn't have to hear bad news directly, didn't have to see failure face to face. 62 years old. Thick hands scarred from decades of breaking things, bones, locks, promises, spirits. A face that had forgotten how to smile genuinely but remembered every slight, every disrespect, every insult going back 40 years. Uni placed the envelope on the table, unopened, untouched. Exactly as it had been delivered 2 hours earlier. The weight of it hit the wood with a dull thud that might as well have been a gunshot. Silence spread through the room like blood and water flow, consuming, impossible to ignore. The kind of silence that precedes violence. The kind that means someone's about to die. Sal stared at the envelope, not at Uni, at the envelope, like it had personally insulted him. Like it was a living thing that had just walked into his club and spit in his face and challenged everything he believed about how the world worked. The red wax seal was still intact, still stamped with the ornate G that meant Gambino, that meant power. That meant this envelope was supposed to be opened, counted, and accepted with gratitude. You lost, friend? Sal's voice was quiet, dangerous. The kind of quiet that preceded screaming. Uni didn't blink. Message from uptown. We sent a message uptown. This looks like the same message. It is. 2 words that changed everything. Sal's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched below his left eye, the same tick he got before he hurt people. He glanced left, then right. His crew didn't move, didn't speak, barely breathed. They were waiting for the play? Waiting to see if this was disrespect worth answering with violence or strategy. Waiting for Sal to decide whether this black man from Harlem would walk out alive or in pieces. Uni knew the game, had walked into rooms like this before. Rooms where one wrong word ended with you floating in the Hudson. Rooms where silence was the only language that mattered. Where reading the moment meant living and misreading it meant dying. But Bumpy had taught him something the Italians never understood. Silence wasn't weakness. It was conclusion. It was the sound of a decision already made, a boundary already drawn, a war already won before the first shot was fired. Sal finally looked up from the envelope, studied Uni's face for cracks, for fear, for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would justify what he wanted to do next, which was pull the .38 from his ankle holster and put 2 in Uni's chest and dump his body in the river as a message back to Bumpy. He found nothing, just calm, just certainty, just a man doing exactly what he was told by a boss who didn't make empty threats. You know what's in here? Don't matter what's in it, Uni said. His voice was calm, flat, final. Matters that it's going back? You telling me Bumpy Johnson don't want Carlo Gambino's friendship? Uni tilted his head. Just slightly, just enough. I'm telling you Harlem ain't for sale. The room inhaled collectively. One of the card players, Frankie Cards DeLuca, set his hand down, slow, deliberate, aces and eights. The dead man's hand, the hand Wild Bill Hickok held when he was shot in the back. Another soldier, younger, maybe 25, shifted his weight like he was preparing to stand. His hand drifted toward his waistband where everyone knew he kept the .45. His fingers twitched. Sal raised a hand barely, just 2 fingers off the table, and everyone froze. The younger soldier's hand stopped moving. Frankie Cards picked his hand back up. The room held its breath. Sal picked up the envelope. Felt the weight. $50,000 that might as well have been 50,000 insults. Turned it over once, twice, like inspecting a gun that misfired. Like holding evidence of his own failure, then he smiled. Not warm, not friendly. The kind of smile a man gives when he realizes he's been insulted so perfectly, so precisely, that anger would be beneath him. The kind of smile that meant someone was going to die, the only question was who and when and how much they'd suffer first. You got a long walk back uptown. I know the way, Uni said. He turned, walked past the card tables. Past the soldiers with their hands near their waistbands and murder in their eyes. Past the espresso bar where the owner Tony the cup. Marconi pretended not to hear every word while memorizing every detail to sell later to whoever paid most. And he walked out the door. Into the street, into the daylight, into the afternoon rush of Little Italy with its tourists and its smells and its noise. Still breathing, still whole, still carrying the message that would change everything. The message had been delivered. Not with words, not with threats, not with violence or intimidation or any of the tools men usually use to communicate power, with refusal. And in New York in 1960, refusal was the rarest form of power. When Sal called Gambino 20 minutes later, he didn't need to explain what happened. The boss already knew. Word traveled fast in their world, faster than cars, faster than phones. The question wasn't whether Bumpy had refused. The question was what Gambino would do about it. Carlo Gambino heard about the envelope 20 minutes after Uni left Mulberry Street. He was in his home in Brooklyn. Bath Beach, modest 2-story house on a quiet block lined with sycamore. Trees that provided shade in summer and dropped leaves in fall that neighborhood kids raked for pocket money. The kind of place where neighbors thought he sold olive oil and imported cheese. Where he walked his dog every morning at 6:30, rain or shine. Where he went to church every Sunday and sat in the same pew he'd sat in for 20 years. Where he waved to the mailman and tipped the paperboy at Christmas. The kind of place where nobody believed the most powerful mobster in America lived. He sat in his kitchen with a cup of tea, never coffee, always tea, a habit from childhood in Sicily where his mother insisted coffee stunted growth and tea built character, reading the racing forms like a man with nothing but time. Like a man whose biggest decision today was which horse to bet on at Aqueduct. His wife, Catherine, was upstairs putting their youngest daughter down for a nap. Normal suburban sounds filtered through the house, a child's laughter, water running. A radio playing Perry Como softly in the background. Normal suburban life, except nothing about Carlo Gambino was normal. Sal walked in without knocking, didn't need to. The back door was always unlocked for family, and in their world, the world that existed beneath the world Sal was family. Blood might have made them Sicilian, but loyalty made them brothers. He set the envelope on the kitchen table, said nothing. Didn't need to, the envelope said everything. Gambino looked at it, then at Sal, then back at the envelope. He didn't touch it. Didn't need to, he knew exactly what it meant. The red wax seal still intact, still perfect, told him everything he needed to know. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just rejected the offer. He'd rejected the entire premise. He opened it. No, he counted. Didn't touch it. Did he say anything? His man said, "Harlem ain't for sale." Gambino's expression didn't change. No anger, no surprise. No visible reaction at all. Just the slow, creeping realization, like frost forming on glass on a winter morning, that he had miscalculated something fundamental about the nature of power. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, an ice cream truck played its tinny melody, the entertainer warped by cheap speakers. A child laughed and begged for money. Someone was mowing a lawn, the smell of cut grass drifting through the open window. A dog barked. The sounds of a world that had nothing to do with envelopes and power and men who refused to bend. He leaned back in his chair, picked up his tea, took a sip. It had gone cold, bitter, unpleasant. He grimaced but swallowed anyway. What did the messenger look like? Tall, maybe 6'2"? Thin, but strong, the kind of strong that comes from work, not Jim's. Didn't flinch when Carmen reached for his piece. Walked out like he owned the place. Did anyone try to stop him? Frankie Cards reached for his gun. I waved him off. Good. Gambino set his tea down, pushed it away. Killing Bumpy's messenger would have started a war we don't need. Would have made us look reactive instead of strategic. So what do? Gambino stared at the envelope for a long time. Most men would have exploded. Would have flipped the table and shattered the teacup and called for blood and sent soldiers to Harlem with orders to drag Bumpy Johnson into the street and make an example that would echo through the underworld for generations. But Carlo Gambino didn't build the largest crime family in America by reacting. He built it by understanding. By seeing the world as it was, not as he wished it to be. By accepting reality and adapting to it instead of trying to force reality to adapt to him. And in that moment, sitting in his kitchen with cold tea and a returned envelope, and the sound of his daughter's footsteps upstairs and Perry Como singing about dreams, he understood something the other bosses never would. Something that separated him from Genovese and Profaci and Anastasia and all the other men who'd let pride destroy them. Bumpy Johnson wasn't rejecting a deal, he was rejecting the premise. The idea that Harlem could be negotiated over like a union contract or a construction bid. The idea that $50,000 or $500,000 or $5 million could buy what 3 decades of loyalty and blood and sacrifice and discipline had built. The idea that an Italian boss, no matter how powerful, no matter how connected, no matter how much of New York he controlled, had the authority to offer partnership in a kingdom he didn't create, didn't build, didn't understand, and had no right to claim. It was the most dangerous kind of refusal. Not emotional emotion could be manipulated, exploited, turned into weakness. Not recklessness could be punished, corrected, made into a teaching moment. Absolute, born from principle, not pride, from identity, not ego. From a place Gambino couldn't reach with money or threats or any of the tools that had built his empire. Gambino had dealt with rivals before. Plenty of them. Men who said no because they wanted more money, those men could be bought eventually, everyone had a price. Men who said no because they were too proud, those men could be humbled through force or fear. Men who said no because they didn't understand the consequences. Those men could be educated through violence or the threat of it. But Bumpy said no because he didn't recognize Gambino's authority to ask in the first place. Because in Bumpy's world and Harlem's world, Gambino was the outsider, the one without standing, the one who needed permission, not the one who granted it. And that was something Gambino had never encountered. Not in Brooklyn, not in Manhattan. Not in all his years building an empire from nothing but cunning and patience and the willingness to wait while other men rushed to their deaths. Someone who genuinely didn't care about the power Gambino represented. Someone who built his own power, different power, black power, community power, and considered it not just equal but superior. At least in Harlem. At least where it mattered. He picked up the envelope one last time. Felt its weight. $50,000. Enough money to buy a mansion in the suburbs, a fleet of Cadillacs. Enough money to change most men's lives, to solve most men's problems, to buy most men's loyalty. Then he tossed it into the drawer beside him like it was junk mail, like it was nothing. Like it was evidence of a failed experiment that taught him something valuable. He just drew a line, Sal said carefully. Told us we can't have Harlem. Every crew from the Bronx to Staten Island is going to hear about this. They're going to think we're weak. No. Gambino's voice was quiet, calm, almost admiring. He reminded me the line was always there. I just forgot, got arrogant. Thought everything was for sale. Sal shifted his weight, nervous now. So what do? We can't let this stand. If we do nothing, every 2-bit operator in the city is going to think they can refuse us. Let them think what they want. Gambino stood, smoothed his shirt, walked to the sink and poured out his cold tea, watching it swirl down the drain like $50,000. You go to war over territory, Sal, not over respect you were never given. War costs money, brings heat, unites enemies. Smart business is knowing which battles to fight. Boss, Bumpy Johnson just taught me something I should have known all along. What's that? Gambino turned. Looked Sal dead in the eye. Some men can't be bought, and the ones who can't you leave alone, because fighting them costs more than winning is worth. Because they'll burn everything down before they bend. And a kingdom of ashes profits no one. He walked out of the kitchen. Left the envelope in the drawer where it would sit for years. Left Harlem exactly where it was, untouched, unconquered, sovereign. And in that moment, the most powerful mobster in America had just acknowledged something no law, no court, no government ever would. Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson. Not as territory to be controlled, as legacy to be respected. The story spread quietly, not in newspapers. The New York Times didn't cover it. The Daily News didn't run headlines. This wasn't the kind of story white media told, because it didn't fit the narrative. They preferred the narrative where black neighborhoods were chaos waiting for white structure, problems waiting for white solutions. But in Harlem, the story spread like wildfire. In barbershops where men got their hair cut and their news delivered. In after-hours joints where jazz played until sunrise and truth was told after midnight. In policy banks where grandmothers placed their numbers and gossiped. In taxi stands, in church basements. In beauty parlors whispered over card games and Sunday dinners. The way real history always moves in communities that don't trust outsiders to tell it right. Bumpy sent Gambino's money back, $50,000. Didn't even open it. Walked it right into Little Italy and handed it back. Told them Harlem ain't for sale. For some, it was just another tale of defiance. Another chapter in the legend of a man who refused to bow. Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd stood up to Dutch Schultz, who'd survived Alcatraz, who'd outlasted every gangster who tried to take what was his. But for those who understood power, real power, not the kind that came from guns and threats, it was something bigger. It was proof. Proof that Harlem wasn't a territory waiting to be claimed. It was a nation unto itself with its own laws, its own economy, its own loyalty structure, its own king who didn't need permission from downtown bosses to rule. The Italians never came back with another offer, not because they were afraid. Men like Gambino didn't fear violence, they calculated it. And the calculation was brutally simple. The cost of taking Harlem by force was higher than the profit of owning it. Bumpy had made sure of that over 30 years. Not with an army. With infrastructure so deep, so loyal, so woven into the fabric of the neighborhood that tearing it out would have required burning the whole block down. And even then, even if you killed Bumpy, someone else would rise? Because the system wasn't built on one man, it was built on community. And Gambino was too smart to fight a community. So the border held, Bumpy stayed in Harlem. Gambino stayed in Brooklyn. The 5 families ran Manhattan below 110th Street, the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island. They controlled the docks and the unions and the construction and everything else, but Uptown? Uptown remained untouched, a sovereign nation inside the city. For the next 8 years, until Bumpy's death in 1968, no Italian crew operated in Harlem without permission. No shakedowns, no muscle, no envelopes, they asked first. And when Bumpy said no, they accepted it. Because they remembered the envelope. Years later, after Bumpy was gone, after Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes turned Harlem into a heroin market, after the drugs carved the neighborhood into something darker, people would look back on the 1960s and wonder how one man held off the largest crime syndicate in America. The answer was always the same. He didn't hold them off. He reminded them they were never invited. There's a difference between defending your territory and refusing to recognize someone else's claim to it. Most men spend their lives defending, drawing lines in the sand and daring others to cross. Bumpy did the latter. He didn't fight for Harlem's independence. He simply lived it. He embodied it. He made it so undeniable that even Carlo Gambino, the boss of bosses, had to acknowledge it. And when Gambino sent that envelope, thick with cash and thin with respect, Bumpy Johnson sent it back with the only message that mattered. This isn't yours. It never was. It never will be. That envelope sat in Gambino's drawer for years, never spent. Never deposited, just there, a reminder. When Gambino died in 1976, his family found it during the estate inventory. Still sealed, still stamped with the red wax G, they asked what it was. Nobody told them. Because some lessons are too important to explain. They have to be lived, remembered, respected. Bumpy Johnson didn't just protect Harlem, he defined what it meant to lead without bending. He showed an entire generation that power doesn't always come from violence or money. Sometimes it comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and refusing to negotiate either. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which untold chapter of his legacy you want next. Because power like this doesn't repeat itself, but the lessons never fade. And Harlem remembers.